Next up, we've got a property that is really useful, but also can be very confusing to beginners or to everyone. The property name is position. It's kind of just like a generic sounding property in my opinion. It doesn't tell you a whole lot, and the property values that we can use are things like static, relative, absolute, fixed, sticky. They are easy to confuse. That might just be my experience, but I've seen lots of students have to refer to the docs for this property. Now, it's super useful. The official description, I guess it's not official, but MDN's little short description is that position sets how an element is positioned in a document. And what you need to know right now is that it establishes how 4 other properties we have not yet used, top, right, bottom, and left, it determines how they work, depending on how position is set. So I'm going to do a demonstration here. We're going to go through this slowly. Once again, I'm in a new folder called position this time. And this is what we have to start with. I have 3 divs. They are all, 100 by 100? And they have a background color. The middle one is what I'm going to play around with and change the position on. So I gave it a different color. And that's pretty much all you need to know for now. Okay, so if we set the position to static, this is the default. This is what every element we've been working with so far is positioned as. So I'm going to begin by setting this div to have a position of static. So I've made a section here with the ID of static. So I'm just going to select that section, and then I gave it the ID of middle just so I could call it out. This is honestly overkill, right? I could use nth of type or something, but just to make it very clear, I'm styling the middle div in, why did I write section? It's supposed to be static. And I'm going to set its position to static, and you'll see that nothing changes. It's what it already was. And these properties I've mentioned, things like top, we don't even know what they do yet, but if I try and use them, nothing happens. They have no effect if an element is positioned statically. So that brings us to the next possible value for position we'll cover here, which is relative. So relative is going to keep the element in the normal flow of the document, but we can offset it relative to itself using top, left, right, and bottom. So for now, it's static. I'm going to change that so it says relative, although that doesn't actually do anything. And then over here in my CSS, I'm just going to select that relative div or section that I created, the ID middle inside of it, and I'm going to set position to relative. I'll refresh. Nothing changes. But now I can go in here and use top, bottom, left, and right. So this is going to offset my element from its current position. So if I set top to be 100 pixels, I'm basically pushing it down 100 pixels. But it didn't shift other stuff around at the moment, right? The space is still left. It's positioned relatively to where it would be if it was just normal, if I didn't offset it. So that space is there. I could move it left, right? Another 100 pixels. Although I'm actually moving it right because I set left to be 100. I'm offsetting it, and we move to the right 100 pixels. I could also do negative values if I wanted to offset it to the left, and if I wanted to go up, I can do negative. I can use other units. It's not just pixels, but I'm just going to do something a little bit neater. How about 50 pixels and 50 pixels? Okay, so that's relative. The element is positioned relative to where it normally would be. Its place in the document is still there. That brings us to our next option, which is absolute. So I'm just going to copy this again, duplicate that, absolute, absolute. Okay. So when we position an element absolutely, the element is removed from the normal document flow and no space is created for the element. So this is really important to understand. If I set absolute, which is that parent container, that middle div, and I set its position to absolute, and I refresh. It looks like we only have 2 divs here, but that's not what happened. There is a div behind it. The other blue div, that dark blue div, is behind this, and this element, the green div in the middle, doesn't take up any space in the document. It's removed from the flow, so it's like this space just collapsed, and they're stacked. Now if I use top, let's offset it, top 50 pixels. Where'd it go? Whoa, all the way up here. Why is it doing that? Let's try left. Let's do left 50 pixels. Why is it behaving so oddly? Well, if we go back to the docs, you'll see that the way absolute works is that yes, the element's removed from the normal document flow, but it's positioned relative to its closest positioned ancestor, if any. Otherwise, it's placed relative to the initial containing block, which you can think of as basically the body. It's positioned relatively, as we saw, to the top of the screen here, if it is not nested inside of a positioned element. This is the part that trips people up. What it means for something to be positioned is that it's basically has a position set to anything other than static. So I could position its parent, which is this section with an ID of absolute. So if I give that section absolute a position of relative, for example, all of a sudden, this div that I have positioned to have position of absolutes and offset by 50 pixels top and left, it now has an ancestor that's also positioned. So it's no longer going to be positioned up here. Now it is relative to its ancestor. Now there's margin here, and this is what's probably throwing you off. But if I select that section, that's the section itself right there. So it's offset from that corner right up there. But these divs each have margin, so they're not actually up against the edge of that div. And we've got that H2 in there that says absolute, but it's positioned absolutely, this div here, so it does not take up any space, unlike this right here. And it is now positioned relative to its parent, which also is positioned. It's very confusing to talk about, but it's positioned relative to that. So if I, set this to be 1 pixel, or even, 1 and 1. There you go. That gives you a better idea. So that one can be tricky for some people to understand because it does depend on the parent's or some parent's position property. And then we've got one more that I'm going to highlight here, which is position fixed. So I'm going to make one more div here, fixed, and then change this title here, this H2 to say fixed. Now for this to really make sense, I guess I could just show it to you first of all. If I position that element, so fixed, the middle div inside, we'll have a position of fixed. And if I refresh, okay, it doesn't seem like much happened. It looks like the same thing as when we had absolute. Now I'm going to give it a top of, how about 100 pixels? Okay, it's up here. Let's do a top of, how about a top of 0 just to make it easier. Top of 0 and left of 0. It has no offset. It goes all the way up to the containing block, the top of our page essentially for now. But what's really important is that when something is positioned fixed, it's going to stay there. Its position is relative to that containing block always. So it's kind of like absolute, except it has nothing to do with any parent elements or anything like that. So yes, it's removed from the normal document flow, no space is created, but it's positioned relative to the initial containing block. There is a little caveat here, but we're not going to go into that for now. So what I'll show you though is if I add a whole bunch of stuff down here. Let's add like a paragraph with lorem times 100. Whoops, did I not hit tab? There we go. And refresh. Take a look at that. It's fixed to the top. How cool, huh? Well, that might have been a little overly enthusiastic, but it's going to stay there, always offset from that initial containing block, in our case, by nothing. 0, 0. Or I could do something like, 400 pixels on the left. And this is how you can make certain things like a nav bar, for example, that stays up top on your screen as you scroll. There's one more value I'm not going to go into for now, but it's kind of cool. It's called sticky. And sticky looks like this right here, where something begins not fixed to the top. It will scroll along with content until it hits the top, and then it stays there. So it sticks. So that one can be nice too, if you want something to start out not fixed, but then get fixed later. So that's position. It can be confusing. The terminology can trip you up, absolute versus relative versus static and fixed. But just take your time and keep the docs open. These are super useful.